Tonight we're going to talk to Luke Epplin about his new book about the 1948 Indians, Our Team, the epic story of four men and the World Series that changed baseball. Reminder to everyone, you can keep up with future Between the Lines events by checking the library's Facebook page or the library events calendar at we247.org. We've got great events coming up with Paula McLean, Willie Lawton, Jess Walter, and more. Tonight, I'm extremely excited to welcome Luke Epplin to Between the Lines. This is Luke's debut book, and his writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, GQ, The Daily Beast, and more. We've got people watching tonight both over Facebook and Zoom. So if you have a question for Luke, just break in with it, and I'll ask Luke your question. Luke's going to start with the reading, but my hope is that those of you participating will take over the event by asking lots of questions. Luke, thanks so much for visiting with us tonight.
Hey, great to be here. Should I just launch right into it?
Oh yeah, launch right into it.
All right, I'm going to read a passage from the middle of the book. So this book, just to sort of set it up, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, is about the Indians from about 1946 to 1948. It focuses on four different individuals in particular: Bill Veeck, the owner of the Indians; Larry Dobie, who was the first Black player in the American League; Bob Feller, the ace of the Indians staff for so long; and Satchel Paige, the Negro League legend who came over to Cleveland in 1948. This chapter is in the middle of the book. It's right whenever Larry Dobie is being informed that his contract is being purchased by the Cleveland Indians. Larry Dobie was on a team called the Newark Eagles, which is in the Negro National League. They were owned by Effa and Abe Manley, husband-wife duo who owned the Eagles. And Larry Dobie had no idea that this was really going down. So the whole thing is a bit of a surprise for him, as you'll see. Chapter 16, A New and Strange World. On July 1st, 1947, the phone rang in the Eagles team office in Newark. Days earlier, Abe Manley had warned his wife that the owner of the Cleveland Indians might call at any time, so it was hardly a surprise to Effa when she found herself in conversation with Bill Veeck. Never one to indulge in small talk, Veeck cut right to the chase, asking Manley how much she expected in a deal for Larry Dobie. This was a welcome question for someone who'd been so outspoken about the need for Negro League owners to be compensated for finding and cultivating their players. Veeck, for his part, had already told sports writer Cleveland Jackson that, unlike Branch Rickey, he hoped to sign Black players through standard procedures, not by means of raids. Before Manley could respond, Veeck put forth an offer for $10,000. Effa Manley fell silent. In her estimation, it was an insultingly low sum, and true to form, she let him know as much. Mr. Veeck, you know if Larry Dobie were white and a free agent, you'd give him $100,000 to sign with you merely as a bonus. She paused to collect herself, then acknowledged that she had limited leverage in these negotiations. While holding firm on $10,000, Veeck promised to wire an additional $5,000 if Dobie stuck with the Indians for more than 30 days. Before agreeing, Manley phoned her husband for his approval. Abe, upon hearing the figure, had the same knee-jerk reaction. Oh, Effa, we can't let Dobie go for that small amount of money. Besides, that would wreck our entire ball club. What about the morale of the other players when they hear we've sold Dobie to the major leagues? Ultimately, mindful of the criticism that would blow their way should they let money block Dobie's path, the Manleys chose to accept the offer. That same day, the Eagles squared off against the Philadelphia Stars in Trenton. It was just another game for Dobie, who knocked in 3 runs on his many hits, sparking his team to a 6-4 victory. He knew nothing of what had transpired between Veeck and the Manleys. Rumors swirled regardless. The following evening, on July 2nd, the two clubs played again in Wilmington, Delaware. After the Stars beat the Eagles with a walk-off sacrifice fly, reporters chased down Dobie and asked if they could expect to see him in an Indians uniform soon. It may be, he answered uncertainly, but I don't know until I get back to Newark. That night, the Eagles bus cut north through New Jersey. It was 5:30 in the morning on July 3rd when Dobie finally stumbled home to his Patterson residence and plopped into bed. The ringing of the phone interrupted his much-needed sleep. Dobie peeked at a nearby clock, a few minutes before 7. Irritated, he fumbled for the receiver. On the other end was Effa Manley. Larry, she reportedly said, you have been bought by the Cleveland Indians of the American League, and you are to join the team in Chicago on Sunday. Dobie was speechless. Hanging up, he shuffled to the center of the bedroom, where he gazed at himself in a mirror. Except for a sock he'd absentmindedly pulled on, Dobie, according to sports writer Sam Lacey, wore nothing more than what he had on when the family doctors slapped him. He stood naked before the journey ahead of him. As the press raced to Patterson to interview Dobie, Beck assembled his own group of reporters in Cleveland to announce the signing. The quotes that circulated in newspapers over the following days laid out Beck's personal take on the milestone. I don't think any man who has the ability should be barred from Major League Baseball on account of his color, Beck declared. The entrance of Negroes into both major leagues is not only inevitable, it is here. It was his belief that the war had advanced us in regard to racial tolerance. I probably will catch hell for a while, Beck said, but it is my hope that it'll work out. Amid these high-minded ideals, Beck offered another, more pragmatic reason for nabbing Dobie. Jackie Robinson has proved to be a real big leaguer, so I wanted to get the best of the available Negro boys while the grabbing was good. Why wait? Originally, Beck had intended for Dobie to make his debut in Cleveland, but now that the word was out, he instructed Lewis Jones to escort the Eagle star from Newark to Cleveland, where the Indians would face the White Sox in a weekend series starting on July 5th. In the meantime, Beck convened an Indians team meeting. Aware of grumblings among some players, he didn't mince words, telling the Indians in no uncertain terms that Dobie was going to be a star someday. So either they shut their mouths and go along with his plan, or they spend the rest of their careers on farm clubs. Publicly, Lou Boudreau supported the move. He issued a statement calling the acquisition a routine baseball purchase, promising to give Dobie every chance to prove he has the ability to make good with us. Privately, however, Boudreau harbored deep skepticism. He begged Beck for help in the outfield, which Dobie, a second baseman, presumably couldn't provide. Besides, Joe Gordon, Beck's major offseason acquisition, had just been voted the starting second baseman in the upcoming 1947 All-Star game, so there was little chance that Boudreau would bench a newly invigorated Gordon to give Dobie playing time at second. It led the Indians manager to wonder if signing Dobie was just another means of drawing fans during a season in which the Indians once again would fall well short of the postseason. Boudreau was fighting for his managerial life as it was. His contract ran out at the end of the season. There was no guarantee another would be extended. He had 3 months to turn around an Indians team that by then had sunk to 5th place and would now be dealing with something as novel and sensitive as integration. On Independence Day, a boisterous holiday crowd, more than 4,000 strong, turned out for the afternoon doubleheader at Newark's Ruppert Stadium. Dobie's mother, Etta, and his wife, Helen, milled about the stands, as did Lewis Jones, who'd ridden an overnight train from Cleveland to fetch Dobie. Because the Newark Bears, the white minor league affiliate of the New York Yankees, had decided to dress at Ruppert Stadium before departing for their own afternoon doubleheader in Jersey City, the Eagles players were forced to suit up elsewhere, then ride the team bus to their home turf. Soon after Larry Dobie stepped off the bus, photographers swarmed him. Stiff and uneasy, he squeezed the handle of his bat so tightly while posing that his knuckles seemed to pop. Later, during fielding drills, Eagles manager Biz Mackey slapped one grounder after another his way. Racked with emotion, Dobie booted some, bobbled others. Before the opening pitch, Eagles players and civic leaders gathered at home plate for an impromptu ceremony. The gifts they presented to Dobie were practical and heartfelt: a shaving kit, a travel case, a check for $50. Amid sustained applause, the public address announcer reminded the crowd of an upcoming anti-lynching meeting in Newark. The opening game was a runaway for the Eagles, punctuated by a moonshot home run that Dobie launched into the left field stands in the 6th inning. It would have been a fitting farewell had he not followed it up by fumbling a ground ball in the 8th, then another in the 9th. Effa Manley had seen enough. "Larry's so nervous he's not himself," she reportedly muttered. "He has a train to make, so I'm sending word for him to get dressed." As the second game got underway, Dobie stepped sopping wet from the shower into a scrum of program-waving kids who'd snuck into the clubhouse for autographs. In between scribbling his name, he buttoned his gray sports shirt to the throat and slipped on a tan jacket with a folded handkerchief in the front pocket. Then he set off with a group of friends and family for Newark's Penn Station. While Lewis Jones bustled about the terminal, Dobie took a seat on a wooden bench, flanked by Helen and his mother. He spoke faintly to the assembled reporters, almost in a whisper, clasping and unclasping his hands all the while. At one point, Dobie turned to his wife, Helen, and murmured, "I feel, well, more than nervous. I feel almost like I was going into a new and strange world." 4 years before, when he was reporting for the Navy, Dobie had waited at the same station for an overnight train to the same city. That journey had exposed him to racial prejudice like he'd never known before. And now here he was again, on the brink of another passage to somewhere far away and foreign. In the eyes of New York Amsterdam News columnist Dan Burley, Dobie appeared in those moments before boarding the train to join with the Cleveland Indians, stunned by the strangeness of his position and deeply afflicted by the role he was so unexpectedly called upon to play. He seemed like a boy going off forever from all the things that had been familiar to him.
Thank you, Luke. That was great. This isn't the time where I want to talk about this, but I think I think one of the hardest parts of the book must have been, or the hardest parts of writing the book must have been kind of getting inside Larry Dobie's head, or getting in, and or he's a character. He seems like he's less accessible than, I don't know, the other larger than life characters who a lot is known about. So,
yeah. So basically, there's, as I said, there's 4 characters in this book that form the primary structure of it: Bill Veeck, Bob Feller, Satchel Paige, Larry Dobie. Of those 4, 3 of them essentially use the narrative of their life as a means of currency. They were so good at sort of self-mythologizing, of taking their feats, whether in Feller and Page's terms, their sort of fastball, the games they played, sort of personas that they adopted, and spinning them into sort of legends, myths, things like that could benefit them both socially and economically. Bill Veeck was somebody who was just sort of expert at creating legends about himself. He was somebody who could tell a story very well, and he was sort of outrageous and larger than life. And it's sort of no mistake that out of those 3 men, they all wrote more than one autobiography. In Feller's case, I think he wrote like 4 or 5. Like, these were men that sort of told their story over and over and over throughout their life. It was sort of way for them to gain things, no matter what. Larry Dobie was very different than that. Larry Dobie never published an autobiography. Dobie did not like to be interviewed very well. I think I say in the book that he whenever an interviewer approached him, it was like Dobie was settling into a dentist's chair. He was uncomfortable around the press, and for good reason. The press misunderstood him quite often. I mean, a lot of times these were white reporters who were not aware of the burdens that he was facing as the lone Black player on the Indians. They didn't sort of understand the extra burdens that he was carrying, the racial abuse that he suffered, the segregation that was happening behind the scenes. And so it was very difficult for him to sort of get that story out or to find sympathetic ears to that. For that reason, Dobie is the hardest person to know. And you really have to dig deep to find out what he thought in the moment in some of these cases. And of course, one of the challenges I had in this book was that all these men are dead. And so you can't go to them for how they feel. You have to sort of suss it out through interviews and things in the papers and things like that. So it was a lot of archival digging to be able to tell Larry Dobie's story in that amount of detail.
In that scene when, I forget what he says exactly, but when he sits down on the bench there, that quote, I mean, the words that you use, is that how did you?
Which quote was that?
In the scene you just read.
Okay, yeah, at the end there.
When he sits down on the bench and he says, I forget what.
Yeah, he turns to his wife.
Is that written down? I mean, did you find that through research, or is that artistic license type thing?
No, none of that is artistic license. Whenever Dobie got signed by the Indians, first of all, Dobie was very young. He was like 23 years old when he got signed. He, unlike Jackie Robinson or Satchel Paige, he was unknown to most of white baseball. Satchel Paige was known because of sort of the persona that he cultivated that crossed racial lines and all the barnstorming tours that he did with players like Dizzy Dean and Bob Feller. Jackie Robinson was known for the fact that he was a college football star at UCLA that sort of put him into the national spotlight. So these were people that white publications, baseball people, reporters would have known. Nobody really knew who Larry Dobie was. So whenever he got signed by Bill Veeck in early July, one of the papers in Cleveland sent their columnist to Newark to watch Larry Dobie's last game there. He got signed on, I believe, July 2nd, and then he played a last game with Newark on July 4th. He went to Newark Penn Station. This is Larry Dobie, where he was going to board a train to meet up with the Indians. And so while he's sitting there in the station, there are probably like 5 to 10 reporters that are just there milling around, sort of sensing that this could be extraordinary. And one of them was named Franklin Lewis. He wrote for the Cleveland Press. He was an extraordinary writer. I think the best sports writer from Cleveland at that time. He had a very good way with words and could really cut to the heart of things. And Lewis wrote 3 different columns about that day sitting there with Larry Dobie. And he's the one that sort of documented Dobie turning to his wife and saying, I feel like I'm going to a new and strange world. So the thing that I tried never to do in this book is to get into the heads of the characters, because I don't know how Larry Dobie was feeling at that moment. I can only sort of, I wouldn't.
You have to maybe guess and try and communicate it.
Yeah, you really have to sort of go by what Dobie himself said in terms of those moments, or what sort of the sort of people on the scenes documented with that. And so, so yeah, all those quotes that were at the end there were from reports at the time.
All right, so backtracking a little bit, we were talking about this, right before we came on, but can you tell everyone a little bit about your background and how you came to the story? Whether you were a Cleveland sports fan before writing this?
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm from St. Louis, or near St. Louis, and it was almost purely by accident. My grandfather was a fan of the St. Louis Browns. In the sort of early half of the 20th century, St. Louis used to have 2 professional baseball teams: the Cardinals, who were usually great, and the Browns, who were usually terrible. My grandfather was unusual in that he was a Browns fan. So I grew up with a greater knowledge of the Browns than a lot of people in my generation did. And anybody who knows anything about the Browns knows that Bill Veeck was the last owner of the Browns. He did some of the more sort of notorious stunts that he's known for, such as, he brought a little person to the plate whenever he was there, a guy named Eddie Goodell. He sometimes had like fans manage from the outfield while he was there. He did crazy giveaways, things like this. And so I was really interested in Veeck and just who this figure was and how he came to basically invent the modern stadium experience. All the things that Veeck was doing, these sort of giveaways, promotions, in between inning entertainment, are now just completely standard in not only baseball, but just whatever sport in the United States. So I wanted to write a book about Veeck and focused on his time in St. Louis. But when I was sort of researching his background, I sort of realized that actually the most important thing Veeck did was integrate the American League. And like, that should be the number one thing we talk about when we talk about his legacy. And so I started sort of going through files at that time, and I noticed that like there are these 4 figures that are just so interested in harmony with each other. You've got Bill Veeck and Bob Feller, sort of 2 white individuals who represent different spectrums of the integration experience from the white sort of angle, Veeck being the more progressive person, Feller being the more sort of traditionalist person. Then you've got Satchel Paige and Larry Dobie, 2 black players who represent completely different generations. Like Satchel Paige and Larry Dobie are close to 20 years apart in age, and they just hail from different periods in the Negro League. So I thought if you put these 4 players sort of in tension with each other, like, and showing the ways they complement each other, the ways they sort of circle around each other, you could tell a really interesting narrative about integration.
Yeah. So has this story has not been told before, correct? I mean, not in this way anyway.
Yeah, I think that's the key phrase there, not in this way. There have been several, as I said, each of these men, minus Larry Dobie, wrote autobiographies. Each of these men also has had biographies written about him, including Dobie had a biography. And so you can sort of glean information about each of these people from all of that. And there was a book that was called The Boys of the Summer of 1948 by a guy named Russell Snyder, where in 1998, so more than 20 years ago, whenever many of these people were still alive, he went and visited as many of them as he could and sort of talked to them about their memories of the World Series 50 years ago. It's not told in a narrative style, as in it's not told from start to finish, the World Series. It's more sort of just these men reflecting.
It might be more about the World Series win and less about integration too. Maybe. Yeah,
definitely. And it's not told in the sort of way that mine is, where I really tried to tell sort of a more exciting, forward-moving narrative. Each chapter in that book is about a different individual. It's still a really great book to check out. But yeah, in terms of the book being told from these four individuals, I don't believe that's been done before.
Yeah, I want to say to everyone too that I put the link to purchase the book in the chat. You can purchase the book from Max Bax, our book selling partner. I give the book my full-throated endorsement for sure. It's I've read. I was telling Luke and my colleague Brian before we came on here that I've done a million of these author talks with a million authors, and I've read every Cleveland sports book, and they're not all written like this one. This is a great read. So Luke, what's your I want to ask, what's your writing background? You have such a gift for establishing these characters as absolute legends so quickly, just just seems like in a few pages. So I wondered what your writing background was.
It's not very extensive, I guess. I majored in English in college. I went to Washington University in St. Louis. I did some writing there. I moved to New York immediately after college, and I've been working in sort of publishing houses, book publishing houses since then. And I've never been like a staff writer or anything like that at any place. But working in book publishing, I've had to sort of read, well, lots and lots and lots and lots of books. And so I've been very fortunate in that I've learned how to, I've had great models that I've been able to follow. I've learned how to structure books. I've worked with authors in terms of shaping their work. And so that's been a real help for me. I've been publishing sort of works here and there in my free time. I was lucky enough to get some stuff in the New Yorker and the Atlantic and things like this, but I'd never published anything even remotely near this length. I went from basically writing pieces that were a couple thousand words to a book that is like 120,000 words. And that's just, I mean, it's going from high school to the pros just all at once. And so it was a tremendous challenge for me to figure out how to do this. I'm glad that you think that I sketched these players out pretty well, but I'll just say that it was a tremendous amount of trial and error for me, probably about a year of writing that didn't go anywhere. So yeah, if anybody here wants to write a book, just know that the first one is hard.
So I see the questions in chat, and I'm going to get to some of those in a second. I want to ask you a question that kind of bounces off of that last one. But how did you decide when you're sketching out these characters? How do you decide which anecdotes to include and which to delete? I have some examples with regard to Feller. So like when you're sketching out Feller, you talk about the smacking of the catcher's mitt, the sports writer kind of going, whoa.
Yeah.
The Ogrodowski backing off the plate in disbelief, and then breaking the strikeout record at 17. But there must be so much more.
There's a tremendous amount there, especially in terms of Feller, as I said, who I think is the most well documented of the four people in the book. He wrote so many autobiographies. He wrote his first autobiography when he was like 26 or 27. So he's been telling he told his life story forever. It's an interesting thing. The way that I approach the book is like this. there are already biographies of these men. There are already autobiographies of these men. So I did not want to sort of replicate that. I wanted to sort of focus on incidents that did two things. One, that showed these men together and experiences that where they're either overlapping or rhyming. So like Bob Feller and Larry Dobie both went to war. They both sort of were in the Navy. They were in basically the same area of the South Pacific whenever they were in World War II. And so I really wanted to sort of show how their experiences completely differed in ways that had to do with their own sort of racial identity, as a way of sort of sketching them out like that. To answer the second part of the thing that I was trying to do, and that goes to what you had just meant, that you had just shown there. So the way that I thought about Feller was that the press definitely thought of him as a sort of storybook character. He was somebody whose dad sensed a tremendous ability in him when he was a very young boy. And so he grew up in a farm in Iowa. His dad just sort of cleared off a part of their pasture and built him a baseball diamond right there. It was essentially the original Field of Dreams. And so Feller cultivated his passion on that sort of field out there. He, through happenstance, makes the Indians at age 17, and in his very first start in the majors, he ties the American League record in strikeouts. 5 starts later, he ties the Major League record in strikeouts. He's 17 years old. He is the boy wonder. There's never been a greater origin story in terms of a baseball player than Bob Feller. I still think it's the greatest origin story that you can imagine. And so the way that I was thinking about telling that story was that you have to sort of like do it in a way that shows both the improbability of it and just the sort of people, even people that had been in the majors for 15 years had never seen anything like it. And so whenever he first comes up and he's throwing pitches to, he's 17, he's throwing pitches to guys that are in their 30s and they're backing off the plate being like, what in the heck is this? Like, they've never seen anybody throw like this. I mean, he's wild, he's fast, he looks like he's about to hit everybody. I mean, they are frightened of him. And so I really wanted to sort of create that sort of sense. And so, yeah, and so I definitely pick and chose anecdotes that would either show how these characters were connected or would sort of get to the essence of what it felt like to experience them in their time.
It's impossible not to be drawn in by Feller's mythology, even if it's a story that's been told a million times and he's told it himself a million times. It's still great.
And you get and the sort of fun thing for someone like me, a researcher, is to see the way that Feller changed his mythology. Like, if you sort of look at the way Feller talked about himself when he was in his later years, in his 70s, 80s, and 90s, it just kept growing and growing and growing. Like his tails grew taller and taller and taller and taller. He claimed that, like, in his very first start, somebody ran into the dugout and hid, and the umpire had to go get him and sort of bring him back onto the field. And I was like, well, that would definitely be in a newspaper if that happened. I just couldn't find it, but. Feller, he would say these things later in life. I said, he loved telling his own story. It was a currency for him, and he made money on it for the rest of his life.
Did you ever have an urge to kind of tear down the mythology? Did you have to, maybe not, maybe once you started uncovering the story and seeing how the pieces fit together.
Yeah. I think that there's so much mythology around all of these people, minus Dobie probably, that the way that I handled it instead was that if I couldn't verify something, like if Feller claimed that X happened, let's say that a player ran into the dugout and refused to continue his at-bat, and I couldn't verify that, or I could just not find it, I just didn't include it. I just kind of figured Page told a lot of stories, Beck told a lot of stories, Feller told a lot of stories. Some of them you kind of have to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think that the most famous one is that Bill Veeck claimed he owned the Milwaukee Brewers, which was a minor league team at that time. This was before he owned the Indians. So this would have been the early 40s. He claimed that in 1942, after that season, the Philadelphia Phillies came onto the market. That is true. That claimed that he was in running to buy the Philadelphia Phillies. And his plan, since this was already wartime and the sort of rosters were being depopulated because so many people were being lost to the service, that in order to make the Phillies a contender, he was going to stock the Philadelphia Phillies roster with players from the Negro Leagues, Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, Monty Irving, you name it, those sorts of people. He also claims that whenever he told baseball commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis that he was going to do this, that Landis sort of took the team away from him, or in other words, made it so that he was unable to purchase the Phillies and carry forth with his plan of integration. There has been a lot of doubt cast on that in recent years because there is just sort of no contemporaneous evidence of it. But it is something that Bill Veeck talked about pretty close after it had happened. I found some articles of Veeck talking about it in the mid 40s. He definitely starts talking about it a lot more in the late 40s. And by the time the 50s and 60s come along, he's spinning the narrative, and it's in his autobiography. I don't see any reason why Veeck. I think it's something he would have done. I think it's something that was in his character. I think that he was the sort of person that could have done this. Maybe he embellished it, but I chose to believe that legend. So it's all just sort of a matter of instinct.
I was going to ask if you believed that, because that's one of those parts in the book where you very easily could have taken the other tack, I guess, or.
Yeah, and I acknowledged it. There was an article that was written. It's been almost a decade ago, talking about how the lack of contemporaneous evidence suggests that Veeck was either making it up or greatly embellishing it.
Yeah, maybe he at least thought it. Let's put it that way. Maybe he at least thought it. I don't know.
But I mean, I do believe that. In earlier biographies of Veeck, before a lot of these people passed away, there were people that claimed that Bill Veeck told them about this plan while it was happening in 1932. So there is sort of evidence that Veeck was at least talking about it, and that Veeck was, and you can go into the archives, and there are articles where Bill Veeck is talking in the Milwaukee papers about the Philadelphia Phillies and how they're up for sale. He's being very cagey, but I mean, his caginess is perhaps evidence that he's planning on doing something.
Yeah.
So I chose to believe it.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, what did you? Something that made me question it, I guess, is there's some quotes he says a couple of times in the book, things kind of echoing what Bob Feller and other people are saying at that time. That there aren't black players who can make it in the bigs, and he says that kind of after the right before he integrates the Indians, after the opportunity to purchase the Phillies and integrate them in past. So about that, is that kind of line something that like the line, there aren't black players that can make it in the bigs. They say it again and again. Is that like a soundbite that athletes fell back on at that time, do you think? Like, trying to think of an example from today, but how athletes say the same thing again and again during press conferences without thinking about it.
Yeah, well, I think it has deep roots in certain parts of the American consciousness, unfortunately. I think whenever a player like Feller was saying it, and not just Feller, but there were many, many white stars at that time or players that just thought that there were black athletes could do things very well. Some of them were fast, could hit hard, could throw hard, like Page could, but they believed that, they believed two things. One, that if they were ever sort of taken off the barnstorming circuit and put into a major league atmosphere where there was a lot of pressure put upon them, that they would sort of fold under that pressure, that they would wilt under the major league spotlight. And two, they were sort of trained to see these black athletes more as entertainers or performers rather than athletes. There's a really interesting section of Hank Greenberg's autobiography where he talks about how in the years leading up to integration, he went to see a Negro League game. I can't remember exactly who he saw, but he said he was sitting there with some of his teammates from the Tigers, and they were watching the Negro League games, and they were just laughing. They were just like, they, were just thought it was funny. And I think a lot of white people were programmed for that. And Greenberg himself says in his autobiography, I don't know why I did this. Like, here were some of the greatest athletes on the planet performing at such a high level, and I was not taking it seriously. And so whenever someone like Bob Feller says, as Feller did often, that Black players were not sort of capable or ready to be in the major leagues, Feller is saying it from a more sort of traditionalist perspective of, he sort of believed that, you get what you want solely by your own merit and achievement, and that's it. And so his sort of idea was that, like, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I sort of worked on my dad's farm. I, cultivated my skills on the sort of my dad's ball field. He got there through sort of self-determination, independence, sort of durable family bonds, all these sort of American mythology, American sort of values that you want to think about. And so whenever Feller is sort of critiquing Satchel Paige, he never says, I don't want Satchel Paige to pitch in the majors because I don't want Black players to pitch in the majors. He's saying that even Satchel Paige is not good enough to be in the majors because he's just not working hard enough. He hasn't sort of elevated himself to the extent that, white players have, I guess. It's more sort of this, it's almost like his sort of life story, his narrative, and the values that he then ascribes to that have blinded him to the sort of systemic racism that is preventing someone like Satchel Paige from going into the majors. Whenever Bill Veeck says something like that, though, I think it's different. Veeck said some very interesting things before and after Larry Dobie comes into the league. He does tell a Cleveland sports writer that he doesn't think that there are very many Black players that could make the leap from the Negro Leagues to the major leagues. This is not an uncommon idea. I think Veeck was saying something along the lines of that because there were no Black stars in Major League Baseball, there hadn't been a generation of kids that were growing up looking at these stars and being like, wow, this is what I want to be. I want to be Jackie Robinson or something like that. And so then this sort of younger generation comes up, and there's a tremendous amount of people then that have trained themselves to think I'm going to be a baseball player. He used the sort of idea of boxing, where there were a lot of Black boxing stars at that time, Joe Louis among others, that kids could look up to, and sort of this new generation of Black boxers were all coming up. And unfortunately, I think it sort of speaks to some of Veeck's blind spots, that he did not think of the idea that these kids were coming up and looking at Negro League stars and saying, I want to be like Satchel Paige or Josh Gibson or Larry Dobie. And so there was a generation of kids that had grown up with stars from the Negro Leagues that were ready there. So it's kind of complicated in terms of where these individuals are coming from and what their motivations are for saying such things.
It seems like, Satchel Paige's barnstorming team beats Feller's barnstorming team pretty regularly. But did Feller not, he must have thought Satchel Paige was a good pitcher, or did he just view him as when they team up for the barnstorming thing, does he view him as a good pitcher or just a good income producer type thing?
He certainly viewed him as a good income producer. I think that Feller hooks up with Paige so often, particularly in 1946 and 1947, because Paige is such a great gate attraction. And so the more sort of Black fans that Paige can draw to the stadium, and the white fans that Feller is going to do, is going to sort of swell the income of everybody. And so they certainly had a sort of economic and financial relationship. I would say that their relationship was much more economic than it was like friendship based or anything like that. I found an article from 1941 that I'm not sure has really been talked about, but Feller and Page pitched a very quick 3-game barnstorming tour in 1941. And this was at a time before Page was in his 40s. And after a game in, I believe it was Dayton, a very enterprising reporter from a Dayton newspaper goes into both clubhouses, Feller's clubhouse and Page's clubhouse, and he has one question for each of them. What do you think of your opponent? And Page answers just profusely. He's like, wow, he's so fast. You can see why he's really good. He just throws that ball and bam, there it is in the glove. He is very effusive in his praise of Feller. Feller is very he's not condescending or anything. He hedges himself constantly. He just says, well, I really wish Page would just throw his fastball more. He doesn't seem to want to do that. He hasn't developed a curve.
Yeah, it's essentially calling him lazy, or it's pretty.
Without saying it, he's essentially doing something along those lines. He does say, I think that Page could make it to the majors, but even then, he's taking who's basically the biggest star of the Negro Leagues and essentially saying he maybe could make it to the majors, which is in a way of saying maybe there's only one person that could do so. And then he sort of changes it later on where he just says that Page is too old and he can't make it to the majors. This is something that Bob Feller is sort of afflicted with his entire life. He goes into the Hall of Fame the same year that Jackie Robinson does. And during that Hall of Fame ceremony, Jackie Robinson and Bob Feller, who were never friendly in real life, a reporter asked Feller if he thought that there would be, if Major League Baseball needed to do something to get more Black executives and managers in the game, since it was pretty much all white in the front office. And Feller said the exact same thing. He said, well, as soon as there's more talent, then there'll be more people in these places. He's in other words saying that there just isn't enough there aren't Black people capable of doing these jobs yet. And so, once they pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do this, then they can do that without, again, looking at the barriers and sort of discrimination that is preventing these individuals from securing these jobs. So it was a blind spot that hindered him throughout his life.
So another question about Feller, and I'll leave the race stuff to the side because. But something I found interesting about him was how invested he was in player empowerment.
Yeah.
You don't think about that happening that much in the area you're talking about, but he's a lot like today's athletes, kind of in that way.
Yeah, Feller. I mean, I'm sounding pretty negative on Feller, and I don't think the book is trying to be that way. I think that Feller is such an important figure in many different ways. One of which is that he is setting the template as the athlete, as businessman. He is somebody who is incredibly savvy about how to make money, and he was that throughout his entire life. Even before he made it to the majors, he is sort of skipping around from town to town in Iowa, making a lot of money, just being basically a ringer for various clubs that needed a star player. One of the first things he does as a 17-year-old when he comes home to Iowa after the season is hire an agent and start getting endorsement deals. He's somebody that is always sort of thinking not only about how he can improve himself as a pitcher, but how then he can make money off of that. Which is quite laudable. Whenever you think about it, that's how an athlete should probably think of himself. And Feller was very clear-eyed about it. He always said that his window for making money was for as long as his right arm could throw that ball over the plate. And so he knew it was limited. And it was even more limited because he went to war very honorably right after Pearl Harbor. He was the first athlete to sign up for the service after the Pearl Harbor attacks. He did not have to go. He could have stayed quite a long time on the home front because he was the sole provider for his family. He probably could have played another 2 years before he had to go to the service, but he didn't. And he volunteered to go to fighting. He didn't just want to be in a promotional capacity. So the sort of downside of that is that he misses out on 4 years, not only of records and strikeouts and all these things, but of money. And so when he comes back from the war, he's very much thinking not only about how he can reestablish himself as a player, but how he can make up for the sort of financial hit that he took going to World War II. And so he decides to basically do the largest, most elaborate barnstorming tour that you can think about. And he decides he doesn't want agents, he doesn't want promoters, he doesn't want to share that sort of cut with anybody. He's going to do it all himself. One reporter called him the Orson Welles of traveling baseball. And I think that's quite right. He kind of becomes like his own franchise. It's almost like he's wedded to the Indians, but he's becoming sort of a free agent in terms of the way that he can sort of make money off of his name and all these sorts of things. And he hooks up with Satchel Paige, and it's just great symmetry because Paige too is incredible at making money. I mean, think about what Satchel Paige had to go through. He's at a time with unyielding Jim Crow laws, segregation, all that sort of stuff. In the Depression, the Negro Leagues are in dire financial straits. Yet Paige is making about as much as a superstar in Major League Baseball. And he's doing that by just pitching constantly. He's going around barnstorming. He's playing on teams that sort of need a boost. He's doing all of these sorts of things to build himself up into a one-man franchise. I think that these are two of the most entrepreneurial-minded athletes that we've ever known. And it's extraordinary, not only that they sort of hook up in these epic barnstorming tours, but that then they become teammates. I mean, it's almost like something that you can't write. It's something out of a movie or something like that.
That's what it felt like to me too. Has there been any interest has this book been optioned for a movie or anything?
We're in talks.
There's been a little interest, yeah, because it's, as I was reading it, I was like, boy, it just has the feel of, like I said right before we came on, it just has the feel of being uncovered, and all these larger than life mythical characters just fitting together in just the right way.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Yeah.
So about Satchel Paige, you write about Paige being Feller's equal in business as well as on the baseball field.
Yeah.
You illustrate that with the story about him using the airplane first, I think.
Yeah.
I was something I wondered, which you didn't really touch on in the book. Was Paige's striving, his money making acumen, I guess, viewed differently than Feller's, even though they're very similar? Was there like a double standard because of his race?
That's an interesting question, because Feller, the way that Feller was portrayed before the war was as the sort of all-American boy. Like, he was 17 when he came up. He was only basically 21 when he goes to the war. So he's still kind of a boy. And so he's this sort of almost like a folksy farmer, sort of a representation of real America, quote unquote. And the fact that Feller was already doing things to really make money didn't really factor into his persona. People thought of, it was kind of the way that people thought of farmers back then, that they were sort of almost backward sort of people that still lived off the land and didn't have electricity or running water or stuff like that. Whenever farmers were actually quite capitalistic individuals, but that's not the way that the imagination thought of them. And so Feller was able to sort of do these things with agents and he even had his own candy bar, like without people really being upset with his money-making ways. When he came back from the war and he started doing these large barnstorming tours, and he started to do these, he was writing books, he had a syndicated newspaper column, he had a radio show, he was just sort of doing thing after thing. He was doing signings in department stores during the season. And people really started to sort of be upset about this. They thought that like he was distracting himself, that it was sort of that he wasn't as focused on his team, and that it was against the sort of persona of the all-American boy, that he was becoming just sort of a money-grubbing sort of individual that didn't care about anything beyond the bottom line. And so white fans turned on him through this sort of monetary focus that he had. Black fans for Satchel Paige, on the other hand, took tremendous pride in the way that Paige built himself up into like his own sort of franchise. The fact that Paige had so much power that he could say to a team, okay, you want me to come and pitch in your town? Well, I'm not going to come unless you guarantee me and my teammates accommodations and a place to eat. And so these towns, some of which would not have had those sorts of things, or at least would have had segregated establishments, had to make concessions to Satchel Paige if they wanted him there, which they did because he made money. He was somebody who used that power in very enlightened ways, even if these were not ways that were necessarily trumpeted by the press. And just the fact that it was at a time, of course, as I said, with these sort of Jim Crow laws being pretty ironclad, the fact that Satchel Paige was so sort of freewheeling and just kind of going everywhere across the country. He was, I think in one interview, Paige said he pitched in every small town in the country. And so a reporter said, if there was a place where baseball was played, Satchel Paige had probably been there. And that was, I mean, tremendous amount of pride for Paige to not only sort of represent himself that way, but to, you know, buy extremely fancy cars and fancy suits and all these things that Paige had. He spent his money quite well. So yeah, they were viewed quite differently at the time. But, you know, I mean, I think that Paige, because of his persona of being sort of a, you know, almost like he had a slow walk to the mound, he had sort of a deadpan demeanor, things like that, that some people, especially in the white press, took that as a sign of, you know, perhaps unintelligence or something like that, or as a stereotype, more like a Stepin Fetchit sort of character. And that's how he was called Stepin Pitchett in a lot of white magazines, with extremely demeaning sort of things like that. And it really covered up that this was, I mean, I think probably the most intelligent athlete of his time, what he did for himself and how he was able to do it. I mean, you can't teach that. He was beyond, you know, what anybody could have. I mean, there were athletes like Josh Gibson who were just as good as Paige, but didn't have that sort of entrepreneurial savvy that Paige had to build himself up into that big star.
Especially to do that during that time, it's remarkable.
Yeah.
Who do you think was the better pitcher, Feller or Paige?
Man, that's tough. I mean, I'd have to say that it was probably Paige. Feller, they were both workhorses with rubber arms who could pitch, you know, daily if needed. The thing that Satchel Paige had was impeccable control. You know, one of the things that people always talked about was that Satchel would occasionally sort of take a dime or a handkerchief or a chewing gum wrapper and put it on the plate and just throw pitch after pitch after it. And then he'd tell people to just move it to different parts of the plate, and he could just kind of throw them right over that pitch. He had that amazing control. Feller was always struggling with wildness, with walking people, with sort of high pitch counts. Feller would not do well in the modern game. He'd be out after 4 innings. Like he's throwing 200 pitches a game or something like that. But I mean, it worked for him. And, you know, I mean, his 1946 season is one for the ages, but yeah, probably Paige.
That was wild reading about that and how, I mean, you can't imagine anyone doing that today. I forget how many innings he said he pitched, but
he threw 373 innings, and he kind of cut it down. He was trying to set the single season strikeout record, and so he was pitching like every 2 days or something like that. And in the very end of the season, I think he had 3 starts and a save opportunity in a week to do it. And so, yeah, he just completely tuckered himself out.
And then like a day later starts his barnstorming tour and all that.
Yeah.
So there's a million questions in the chat. So I'm gonna just get to some of them, and I'm gonna read them at the same time that you hear them. So it'll be exciting.
Yeah.
So let's see. Well, the first one's about Feller and race. So here's an interesting one. That kind of touches on some of the stuff we've touched on, but did Dobie or Page ever confront or challenge Feller on his views on Negro players? I mean, they must have heard what he was saying in the press.
Yeah. No. I mean, it certainly wouldn't have been something that Satchel Paige hadn't heard a million times before. The sort of line about Page that he said throughout his life was that people would come up to him and say, "If only you were white," as in like you would have been in the major leagues then. So what Feller was saying was not, I mean, it's kind of shocking for us to hear these sorts of things, but it was not atypical of a white player to say such a thing. There are two things with Page. One, in the 1946 barnstorming tour that Feller and Page did together, Page sued Feller at the end of that because he felt like Feller was not paying him the percentages that they had agreed upon beforehand. And so Page, challenged Feller monetarily in court to get what he thought he deserved, which, is, I think, a very big and interesting step. And the second is that Page didn't necessarily respond to Feller, but if you read a lot of interviews with Page at that time, he is talking obliquely to that idea. There's one interview he did in 1941 where he sort of talked about how if he ever went to Major League Baseball, it'd be like he'd be on a vacation, because he was like, they pitch every fourth or fifth day. I pitch every day. And he's like, I'd like to see the Major League players do what I do. So in other words, when Feller was kind of intimating that Page was perhaps a little lazy for not bearing down as hard, Page is throwing it right back at him, not sort of directly. He's not saying this about Feller, but I think that the subtext is unmistakable. And he's saying that, he's even saying things like, oh, we don't get any baby in. We have no trainers. We get into a car, we drive all night, we play. We get into a car, we drive all night, we play. And so he's, in other words, saying that a major leaguer couldn't do what they did, that major leaguers were too lazy. And so Page is definitely subverting the script there. He's not directly addressing Feller, but I think you can definitely see, or you can intimate that he's talking about what Feller is saying.
I was interested in how was that lawsuit covered in the media? When Page sues Feller at the end of their barnstorming tour, and who won?
Page won.
Oh, he did.
He did, yeah. He got over $1,000. It wasn't covered very much. The barnstorming tour itself was kind of a curiosity in the white media.
Yeah.
A lot of people thought that Bob Feller, it was definitely covered as like, what is Feller doing? He's going to tire himself out. There was even sort of idea that Feller could go bankrupt because he put all of his money into that tour. But in the black press, the barnstorming tour was covered extensively. I mean, one of the great things that Feller did was that he, by building such a big platform for sort of white versus black matchups at that time, he generated so much interest from white and black fans alike that a lot of white fans, sports writers, executives who had never seen black players or had heard of them or something like that, got to see them in real time, and they got to see them beat Feller. They got to see that Feller's team had Stan Musial and Mickey Vernon and Bob Lemon and all of these great people. And the black team consistently beat them. And so it was a real showcase and a way of sort of debunking these myths that so many white people had for them. And so in the black press, it was it was followed intently. It was a source of great pride whenever Page won. And Feller's comments were also reported extensively about the players.
Okay, so the story of the Indians signing Larry Dobie is not nearly as mythologized as the story of Jackie Robinson going to Brooklyn. Did you have a hard time piecing together the story of Dobie being scouted to Cleveland?
Yes.
And do you think that he and Robinson's stories are similar or different? Does that?
Yeah. No, so whenever Dobie is scouted, the Dodgers were looking at Dobie for basically 2 years. They were looking at him in 1946, to the extent that Branch Rickey himself showed up to a Newark Eagles game to sort of look at Dobie and Monty Irving at the time. Effa Manley, who owned the Eagles, was very upset with Branch Rickey for the fact that Rickey took black players such as Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella from the Negro Leagues without compensating the owners of the teams that those players belonged on. They thought that, Effa Manley thought that owners such as herself deserved some sort of financial payment for the fact that they discovered and scouted these players and then developed them, had them on their team, helped them along their journey. And so Effa Manley was very against Branch Rickey taking them. In fact, whenever Rickey was scouting on the Dodgers, she went up to him in the stands and said, "You will not be taking any more of my players." And so it was kind of a tension there between them. In 1947, there was kind of an arms race to get Dobie. The Dodgers were on the verge of signing them. Bill Veeck sent one of his scouts, Bill Killefer, out there to get him. And you can read sort of blurbs of what Killefer put in his scouting report. There are plenty of articles that sort of talk about the scouting report that he filed on Dobie. But I think the most interesting thing is that Branch Rickey was going to sign Larry Dobie first. And then he found out that Bill Veeck was also interested in him, and he backed off. He believed that even though he wanted Larry Dobie for the Dodgers, he thought that it was more important that another owner of a major league team signed a black player than it was for him to get Larry Dobie personally, because he knew that as long as the Dodgers were the only club that had black players, integration was just kind of an experiment, just kind of something that one club was doing. But if another club started signing black players as well, then it would be something that the leagues were doing, that more clubs were doing. It was spreading. And so he believed that it was going to help his cause more for Dobie to go to the Indians. Of course, Dobie and Jackie Robinson's experience were extremely different. Jackie Robinson was signed in late 1945. He was older. He was 27 in 1946. He spent an entire year in the minors on the Montreal Royals. That gave him a chance to acclimate, and it also gave his teammates a chance to acclimate, to sort of wrap their minds around the idea that this individual was probably coming up for the Dodgers soon. Jackie Robinson goes to 2 spring trainings before he breaks in. And so he has this sort of buildup to whenever he's going to be on the Dodgers. Larry Dobie journeys literally overnight from the Negro Leagues to the major leagues. He is in an Eagles uniform on July 4th. He is in an Indians uniform on July 5th. It is such a shock to his system that he later told Wendell Smith, the great reporter, that in his first 10 at-bats in the major leagues, his teeth were chattering. He couldn't get them to stop. I mean, I can't even imagine what it must have felt like to have that sort of thing suddenly thrust upon you. And he's much younger than Jackie Robinson. He's not used to the spotlight. He's introverted, and he does not make good in the majors right away. Jackie Robinson leads his team to the World Series in 1947 and wins the Rookie of the Year. Larry Dobie rides the pine in 1947. He has a teammate quit the team because he doesn't want to play with Larry Dobie. He has just a very chilly reception in the clubhouse. And so, I mean, it really is quite different what these two men went through.
Question about Dobie and Satchel Paige. When Dobie came to the Indians, he and Paige roomed together, but their relationship, they weren't close.
No.
Dobie thought Paige's antics stood in the way of black players gaining respect from white fans and teammates. Do you think that white audiences and teammates had respect for Paige at the time he was playing? Or was he, when he came up to the Indians,
that's an interesting question. White audiences had heard of Satchel Paige, even if they'd never seen him. There were profiles written of Paige in the Saturday Evening Post, in Time magazine, and sort of major newspapers across the country. There was sort of, even if you didn't know him, you were aware of him. And the way that they depicted him, they called him sort of satchel foot. They really talked up his sort of his lanky demeanor, the sort of indeterminacy of his age. They definitely spoke of him as somebody who was almost clownish. And in fact, it wasn't uncommon for white sports writers to use the phrase clown pitcher whenever they talked about Satchel Paige. And so white audiences were unaware of what to expect from Satchel Paige. You look at these sort of first reports of Paige pitching in Cleveland, fans were super excited to see him. They packed the stadium to try to see him. But some fans were laughing whenever Paige was winding up because they thought that he was a clown pitcher, that this was another one of Bill Veeck's stunts or something like that. But Paige made it very clear that once he was on that mound, he was all business. It was just, unless the competition was inferior, he was somebody who was there to get the batters out. He would always say, pitching is a serious business, and I am a serious pitcher. And so white audiences, I think some of them were taken aback by the idea that Satchel Paige was so skilled at what he was doing. He was not a clown. In fact, there's an exchange that I had to cut from the book. One of the sort of first interviews he does in Cleveland, the writer keeps saying to him, why aren't you doing more sort of clowning around antics out there? And Paige is just kind of dumbfounded by the question. He's just like, why would I do that? He's like, well, I thought that's what you did. And he's like, I'm a serious pitcher. He just kind of keeps repeating that. I am a serious pitcher. And I think that's what a lot of white audiences missed about him. It's also something that Larry Dobie seemed to miss about him. Larry Dobie looked at Satchel Paige, who was 17 years older than he was, and from a different generation in Major League Baseball, and saw a sort of white affirmation of black stereotypes, this sort of step and fetch it pitcher. And Larry Dobie frequently said that he tried to carry himself with dignity, and he didn't think that the way that Paige carried himself was dignified. And so he was somebody who was constantly telling Paige, like, you've got to show up on time, you've got to dress like we do, you got to do things like this. And Paige was basically like, who is this guy telling me what to do? Like, this Larry Dobie, like, they just didn't get along the way that you would assume they would have, but they simply didn't.
Question from Michael in chat. Could it be a fair analogy to link Satchel to Muhammad Ali?
Yeah, that's a really, I think that is a very fair analogy to make. I think that Muhammad Ali and Satchel Paige had very different personalities. Muhammad Ali was somebody who was very loud and outspoken and sort of, in the press kind of, energized and things like that. As I said, Satchel Paige had a sort of more stoic, laid back demeanor, but he sort of was somebody who was dispensing the same sort of like poetry, incredibly intelligent quotes, brashness, trash talking, all of these sorts of things that Muhammad Ali was doing, Satchel Paige was doing. I mean, it's reading quotes from Satchel Paige from reporters, things that people are just asking him and Paige is responding. You almost have to think to yourself, did Satchel Paige write that beforehand? Because it is such a great quip. He is just so intelligent at just kind of bandying back and forth with reporters and sort of talking about his feats and his legends and things like this. These are definitely two people that were extremely good at capturing the press, at mythologizing themselves, and at backing up their talk with feats on the field. I would definitely say that Satchel Paige could be a template for Muhammad Ali in some respects.
Cool. So I realize we've been going on a little bit long here, but I've got a few questions about Bill Veeck and then a few general questions at the end, if that's all right.
Yeah.
A few more minutes here. So I love the passage just after Veeck becomes owner of the Indians when he's arriving at the stadium for the first time. They usher him to the owner's box, and he says, hell, I never sat in a box in my life. I ain't no rich boy. And of course, he's coming there directly from his 10,000 acre ranch. So really, he's kind of mythologizing himself, but in a way that aligns really well with what Cleveland tells itself, which is, let me paraphrase LeBron. And where nothing is the town where nothing's given, everything's earned, and we work for what we have. That's Cleveland. And so my question is, did Bill Veeck, did Veeck invent that Cleveland, or did he just, did he invent that myth for Cleveland, or did he just come into Cleveland at a time when the myth was already growing and he kind of latched onto it and helped it grow?
He definitely latched onto it. I don't think he invented that. I think that Cleveland has had that sort of attitude throughout its history. Veeck was somebody who was his wife. His second wife once said that he was born on one side of the tracks and then dragged himself over to the other. So he was born rich, and he was somebody that had a privileged lifestyle.
Yeah.
But he definitely sort of portrayed himself as the common man. And I think in many ways he was. He was privileged, obviously, but he was somebody who did not sort of adhere to the sartorial norms of the time. He didn't wear ties and hats and suit jackets and things like that. He refused to sit in owners' boxes. He loved sitting in the bleachers with fans. He loved sort of imagining to himself what would be entertaining for the common fan. He was always trying to sort of put himself into the fans' perspective and being like, wouldn't it be awesome if we had tightrope walkers or something like that? That was sort of more his attitude. And the way that he comes to Cleveland, he senses something. He himself is extremely intuitive and perceptive. And he comes to Cleveland and he sees a city that has been through a depression that basically waylaid its industrial sector, then went through a war that was traumatic for everybody, but especially in Cleveland, where there was such a big wartime industry that caused workers to just be working around the clock. And then after the war is over, that industry is still humming and it's still going. And people are finally kind of coming out of their shell a little bit from the depression and the war, and they're ready to let loose. And there on the lakefront is this giant stadium, 78,000 people. It's considered to be a mistake on the lake. No way anybody could ever fill that thing. But Bill Veeck comes to town and looks at it and is like, that's what's going to bring Cleveland back. And so he just kind of sets about creating this frenzy that would take over the town and make it so that a Tuesday game in 1948 could draw 75,000 people to the stadium. He's like the Pied Piper. He just comes into town blowing his tune and people just follow him.
Who was your favorite character to write about in the book?
Well, I think that I think that Veeck and Page are actually pretty kindred souls. They're very theatrical. They're excellent with the press. They're excellent with the media. They're excellent with their mythology. I really think that those two are sort of tied at the hip. They're really fun to research. Bob Feller was a complicated individual. I think that it was interesting to sort of look at his layers, but I think that Larry Dobie was the most challenging and therefore the most rewarding. Whenever you found something for Dobie, he didn't say much. A lot of times in interviews, he would give sort of one-word answers, or he'd just kind of, not say anything. But every once in a while, a reporter caught him at the right time or sort of got to him when he was ready to talk. And then he was so open in his emotions. It's like he wore them on his sleeve, and it was just, they would pour out of him. And it would be almost to the point where it was like a hallelujah moment. You really had to dig for those gems from Dobie, but once you found them, it was worth the effort.
Can you talk a little bit? There's a question which makes a good point that says we haven't talked about the 48 World Series wins. So can you talk a little bit about how these four characters combined to deliver the World Series? How each of them.
Okay, so the one thing that the book kind of really goes into, and I don't want to give any sort of spoilers or anything, although I imagine everybody that's here knows it. Larry Dobie really does he fails in 1947. He looks like somebody who's not ready for the majors. He is very nervous. He gets only a couple of hits. There's no guarantee that he's going to be back on the Indians. When he goes to spring training in 1948, there are 8 outfielders that are competing for 6 spots. And Larry Dobie is switching from second base, which he plays on the Newark Eagles, to the outfield. He's never played the outfield professionally before. There's sort of this idea that he's going to need to go to the minors to get seasoning before he comes back up to the Indians, learn how to play the outfield. But he has such incredible spring training that Lou Boudreau, the manager of the Indians, just is like, I can't let him go. I have to hold on to him because he is just tearing the cover off the ball. So Boudreau and Veeck decide to keep Dobie on the team. And it just is one of the decisions in 1948 that leads to an absolutely epic season. I mean, that season is itself almost like a storybook. Like, there are 4 teams that are just neck and neck that entire season. It comes all the way down to the end. And Larry Dobie, who had started the season so sort of shakily, ends up being one of the main heroes of that team. He hits over 300. He has extremely timely hits at times whenever the Indians need them the most. And it's also a season whenever Bob Feller really struggles. Feller is under 500 at the All-Star break. He is really, he's getting booed everywhere he goes, including at home. And really, if Feller had pitched up to his standards, Bill Veeck might not have felt such urgency to reinforce the pitching ranks. Bill Veeck is thinking to himself, we are thin in pitching. We need more to keep up with the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Athletics. And so he brings Satchel Paige in. It's really Feller's swoon that allows Paige to rise. And Paige just goes through an epic tear in 1948. I mean, he's exciting fans across the country. In Chicago, where he pitches against the White Sox, fans are so eager to see him. They literally rip a turnstile from the floor and just flood in. Comiskey Park at that time holds 50,000. 70,000 people or more are at that stadium. It is so crowded that ushers are hiding in the bathroom so that they don't have to tell people, can I see your ticket? I mean, it's just a wild roller coaster ride that the Indians barely survive and get into the World Series against the Braves. And there you have some just incredible moments from Bob Feller's Game 1 appearance, where he has a 2-hit shutout going into the later innings and then loses it in just heartbreaking fashion. That is not necessarily his fault. It's a bad call by an umpire. And then you've got Game 4, where Larry Dobie, it's a swing game of the World Series. Johnny Sain is pitching for the Braves. Larry Dobie comes up and hits this epic home run that really gives the Indians the win and cements his place in sort of Indians history. I mean, you have so many incredible moments there in the World Series, and it really sort of heralds Larry Dobie's rise. After that World Series, the sort of press thinks to themselves that Larry Dobie is going to be better than Jackie Robinson, that whenever we think back to this period of integration, we will be thinking of Larry Dobie because he is going to be the big superstar of that period. I mean, it really was kind of a coronation period for Larry Dobie. It doesn't really end up happening that way. His career becomes a little uneven, but it really kind of solidifies his place there. Sorry, that's a long answer.
No, great answer though. Give the people what they want, you know? Yeah. That's perfect. So I saw you'd written an article called The Idiot's Guide to Writing a Baseball Book back in 2017.
I did, yeah.
Were you working on this book when you wrote the article?
No, I wasn't. I wrote a book. I wrote an article for the Daily Beast called The Idiot's Guide to Writing a Baseball Book. And basically what I was seeing was that there were so many baseball books where people would just pick a year. So you could pick, 1964, 1941, 1908, whatever, and just sort of make the claim that this was the greatest year in baseball history. And then they would sort of go through why that is, and they would sort of recount the year. And, there was usually an exciting World Series, a couple players broke records, whatever. And I just kind of thought that's too easy. Like
it's kind of like I buy fiction at the library, and it's kind of like this is the World War II love story that you've never heard before.
Right, yeah. It's kind of a paint by numbers book. And so, the sort of uncomfortableness that I've always had was that some people have asked me, why did you write about the 1948 Indians? And I've always told them I didn't. I wrote about 4 different people and the ways that they intersect and intertwined and sort of came together and invented what is essentially the modern game. And their narratives just happened to culminate in the 1948 World Series. So I never thought of my book as being about the 1948 Indians. I thought of my book about being about these 4 people. And the story concludes with the World Series.
Did you think of it as like a different kind of baseball book when you were writing it?
So my model was, there was a book by a writer named Mark Harris, and he's a film writer and he's excellent. He wrote a book probably more than 10 years ago now called Pictures at a Revolution. And what he did was he took the 1967 Oscar race. And in 1967, you had movies like Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, In the Heat of the Night, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, things like this. And it was really the year that the young boomer up and coming generation with their sort of different values took over Hollywood. And so he took each one of these movies and sort of examined how it sort of talked about like violence in Bonnie and Clyde, race in the heat of the night, youth in The Graduate, things like this that were sort of inventing the way that Hollywood was doing movies. But the way that he told the story was not just, here's a chapter on this movie, here's a chapter on this movie, here's a chapter on this. He intertwined them in such interesting ways where these movies were all in conversation with each other. And so that was the way that I was thinking about these 4 different individuals. I wanted them to sort of bump into each other and sort of like resonate off of each other. Bill Veeck and Page could resonate, then Feller and Page could resonate, then Dobie and Page could resonate, and sort of just looking at the way these characters mingled. So yeah, that was the model that I was going with.
So what's coming up next for you? Are you going to continue writing books about sports, or do you think you'll write something totally different?
I don't know. Because I'm not from Cleveland, I did not grow up with stories about the 1948 Indians. And I did not grow up with stories about Larry Dobie and Bob Feller and all these people. And so whenever I was researching this book, I was discovering it for the first time. And it was so exciting to me. There were certain points in my research where I thought to myself, this is the greatest baseball story ever. I didn't think
I felt the same way. I really did. It's got to be just the unique, the 4 larger than life characters and how it seems like they all, what they are mainly is a part of this story.
It just happened in Cleveland. And it was just like Cleveland had the greatest baseball story ever happened right there. And I'm not saying that I told it in a great way. I'm not saying that my book is the greatest ever. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that this story itself is the greatest in baseball history. It has everything that you want: the exciting pennant race, the sort of integration angle, the sort of promotion angle with Bill Veeck, the business angle with Feller. It has everything. And so I thought to myself, I could never tell a better baseball story than this. So I don't think I'm going to write another baseball book. I've been looking more into basketball.
Oh, so you will write another sports book, but maybe basketball.
Yeah.
Another historical book, you think? Or
I think so. Yeah. So that's what I'm looking at.
Cool. All right. So I always end these interviews by asking questions about books, book recommendations. Since I work at a library, we're all about the books. So, what are the greatest Cleveland sports books ever written?
Greatest Cleveland sport books.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is a book by Franklin Lewis, who I mentioned earlier. He's the one that was at the train station with Larry Dobie when Dobie was about to take the journey from the Indians. He wrote a book immediately after the Indians won the World Series in 1948, and it is simply called The Cleveland Indians. And it gives the entire history of baseball in Cleveland from the 1800s to 1948. I don't know if all of it is true, because it seemed like Lewis was taking a lot of liberties, but it is super entertaining and it is a lot of fun to read, and I can't recommend it enough. Of course, the ultimate is Veeck is in Wreck. This is the first autobiography that Bill Veeck did, and it is outrageous. It is super fun. It's a little dated in terms of like the names and stuff like that. You might not recognize everybody that he's talking about, but I mean, Bill Veeck, it's almost like he's at a bar talking to you. he's just telling tall tales all around. So that is really great. If you want to get into Satchel Paige, there are two books that I would recommend. One is by Larry Tye. He wrote an autobiography or a biography of Satchel Paige simply called Satchel. And that really deconstructs the myth of Satchel Paige. It gets into lots of pockets of Paige's own sort of mythology and how he invented himself and things like that. But you should really look at Satchel Paige's autobiography. I think it's called Maybe I'll Pitch Forever. And Paige himself it's a great combination of tall tales and just straight out just brashness. Just him just sort of being, basically saying I'm the greatest. But he's also vulnerable in some ways. He talks about how hurt he was whenever Jackie Robinson integrated the major leagues. He really thought that all he did for Black baseball to make it into something that was, on the radar of white individuals and things like that, that he should have been the one to be the first to cross over. And when he wasn't, he was hurt. So you get to see sides of Paige that you really wouldn't see before. So those are some great Cleveland books there.
What about other books about the integration of baseball? Anything you would recommend? Yeah,
there's a couple. I think the greatest book on integration of baseball is called Baseball's Great Experiments. Oh gosh, I am completely blanking on the name of who wrote this. But it was the first real comprehensive look at the integration of baseball. It has a lot in there about Larry Dobie, and it gets into the Negro Leagues quite well. For the Negro Leagues, there's a book called Only the Ball Was White by Robert Peterson. That is the first comprehensive history of the Negro Leagues, and I still think one of the best. It is full of just great stories. In terms of sort of later stuff, I really love books by David Halberstam. David Halberstam wrote a book called October 1964, and it was definitely a model for my book as well. It looked at the St. Louis Cardinals and the New York Yankees in the 60s. The Yankees that were coming off of sort of a string of World Series wins. And because of all those wins, they were very slow at integrating their roster because they figured they didn't need to. They had all these great white players, Whitey Ford, Mickey Mantle, Yogi Berra, players like this. The Cardinals, on the other hand, had a very bad 1950s, and they made the decision that they needed to integrate to get better players into their system. So they had all of these great Black players coming up in the 60s, Lou Brock, Bob Gibson, Curt Flood, tremendous amount of talent there. And they face each other in the 64 World Series. So for Halberstam, it's like the old school white team of the Yankees versus the new look Cardinals of the 60s. And it's just this great sort of book about racial dynamics of that time. I can't recommend it highly enough.
Awesome. Thank you for the recommendations. So that's all I've got. Luke, thank you very much for visiting with us tonight. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Great conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was great to be here.